To CAF Warbird Tube, a show where we talk about warbirds, history, World War II, flying, and much more. This show is supported by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum, and this nonprofit membership organization has preserved and flown historic aircraft for more than 65 years. CAF's mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. And you can support CAF through your donations, by membership, or by volunteering your time and talents. Visit commemorativeairforce.org for more information, including the location of CAF units near you and a schedule of where our aircraft will be appearing at air shows and aviation events throughout the summer and fall. I'm your host, Steve Buss, and we just want to welcome everyone watching tonight on Facebook, on YouTube, and those of you on GoToMeeting. If you would, please just take a second to like or share and hit that subscribe button and follow us. Now, if you do subscribe on YouTube, also click that little bell icon to get notifications about when new episodes go live on Warbird Tube. As you're watching tonight's presentation, you may have some questions. Just type them in the comment section, and we'll try to answer them either during the presentation or before we sign off. Now, in tonight's episode, we're going to travel back a little further in time than World War II. We're usually centered on World War II, but we're going to learn about the Yale Flying Club, and that's a group of young men who would help launch naval aviation and shape the future of military aviation from World War I, World War II, and beyond. So joining us tonight is award-winning author Marc Wortman, who wrote the book, The Millionaires Unit. Marc, thanks for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Steve. I'm glad to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about your background and why you started digging into this story. It's a very fascinating story and one that's not very well known.
No. And that actually was part of what led me to dig deeper into it. So going way back into the recesses of the past, this would have been back in the mid-1990s. I was an editor at the Yale Alumni Magazine, even though I didn't go to Yale, but I was working there. And I did an article about the history and present-day aviation at Yale. The current incarnation of the Yale Flying Club was actually started by another aviation pioneer, Fred Smith of FedEx fame. But that was part of the story. But when I went flying with members of that club, they told me that there was this illustrious past club, the Yale Aero Club, that started out in 1916. And so, and then I started looking into that for that article. And I knew a fair amount about military history. I wouldn't call myself a specialist or an expert, but I knew quite a bit. And I was shocked to find out about this group because they had such an immense role during World War I. And then the members of the group, it was just 29 young men, almost all of them college students at Yale, continued to have a big influence on aviation, commercial aviation, military aviation. And at that time, there hadn't been any book written about them in 75 years. And so that really drew me into it. And then what blew me away and said to me, I got to do something here, was I started reading the letters of Kenneth Mcleish, one of the members of the group. Kenneth Mcleish, Kenny, as he was known, was the brother of Archibald Mcleish. Archibald Mcleish was would go on to be a three-time Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright and poet. And his brother had some of those same talents, and he wrote a series of letters or letters to home and to his fiancée, in which he talked about his experience flying and basically how the experience of learning how to fly sort of transformed his sense of self. I'm sure some of your listeners probably have had that same experience. And then he started talking about some of his missions when he got over there. got over to Europe, and he described there was a particular mission he described in which he and his observer were hit by flak while on a mission over German-occupied Belgium, and they lost power, and they lost partial control of the airplane, and they sailed out over neutral Holland. And while they were over neutral Holland, they could have ditched, put down, and said, and they would have been interned for the rest of the war, and come home rightfully acknowledged as for their bravery and for their service. But Mcleish was able to get that aircraft powered back up again. He still only had partial control of it because a bullet had shot out one of his ailerons, and he managed to turn back, and he flew back to over Belgium, facing the flak again, and landed to fight another day. And I said, wow, who are these guys? There was, these were sons of privilege, and I thought I knew a lot about Yale history in particular. And then I said, this is a different world, and I need to know more about it. And so that sort of set me down that road.
Well, let's take a walk back in time, back to the feeling of the country, the world during World War I. I mean, it begins in 1914. We just had the I guess anniversary, if you want to call it that, the historical point of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which was actually yesterday, the 28th of June in 1914. Hostilities start in July, the end of July, almost a month later in 1914. But take us back to that time and what was going on in the world.
Sure. Yeah. So we have to imagine a very different world. This was a world of empires, royal empires in Europe and throughout the Middle East. These empires were remarkable, were led by kings and kaisers and royal families that were incredibly intermixed. Queen Victoria, the late Queen Victoria's grandchildren sat on two thrones, in England and in the Kaiser in Germany. They would summer together, and yet when there were various alliances, a number of them secret, and after Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, these alliances were invoked, and you had the Russians coming in, you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany, France, and then Great Britain. And the general sense was, this is going to be a short war. This is going to be a short and glorious war. Europe had been, by and large, at peace for almost 50 years. And but there were rivalries. There were family rivalries. There were colonial rivalries. They had colonial empires that each coveted. And the thought was, we'll just have a quick series of war. We'll grab some territory, and that'll be it. We'll avenge the assassination. But of course, as one book called it, they sleepwalked into a war that ended up being a war of attrition. The lines stalemated in Europe, both on the Eastern Front between Russia and Germany, and on the Western Front, as it was known famously, that ran from the North Sea all the way over to Switzerland. It was about 440 miles with about 12,000 miles of trenches, as we see in this photograph. And every so often, the forces of one side or the other would sally forth. They would face They would use Napoleonic tactics, charging into machine guns, industrial warfare, artillery on a scale that had never before been experienced, and the slaughter was massive. They were coming up in early July. We'll be on the, I think it's the 106th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, where Great Britain thought, oh, we will pulverize them, their lines with artillery, and then we'll just have a cakewalk across the lines, and we'll have a breakthrough, and we'll cause the Central Powers to collapse. Well, as they went out over the top and into no man's land, the slaughter was immense. It was something like 54,000 sons of England and Scotland were killed within minutes. Not killed, casualties within minutes. It was close to 20,000 killed. And then these battles continued back and forth at just atrocious. The carnage was unbelievable. I think I saw this statistic that something like 230 soldiers, sailors, and airmen per hour of war were killed in the war. There were 70 million combatants. Half of them ended up being casualties, 10 million of them dead, 7 million civilians. We have sort of much greater scale of death in World War II because of the immense number of civilians who were killed in the in that war. But in terms of carnage per square mile, there's probably never, other than perhaps the Civil War in the United States, and it's a good comparison. There has never been a war as violent.
It really is, and it's something that we've, in today's society, have kind of lost touch with, as to how deadly that was. When you're seeing, as you said, Napoleonic tactics. Thank you.
There you go.
So the old style of fighting in combat versus some of the new technology, the airplane, of course, being one, mechanized weaponry like tanks, machine guns, things like that. So using the old mindset of conducting war against brand new weapons, it really was a clash of times.
Yeah, and we're actually, while it's of course with immensely more powerful artillery, we're actually sort of witnessing the revival of a war of attrition in the Donbass in Ukraine at the moment. So I wish it wasn't happening, but it sort of allows us to reimagine with real-time imagery the nature of this war that was going on, in which there were immense numbers of artillery that were behind the front lines, shooting over the front lines to hit the opposing side's lines, and then the return fire. And it was the first war in which very often you did not see the person who killed you. And and of course there was this new dimension of air warfare in the skies. We have to, if you think about it, 1914, we are 1903, right? The Wright brothers.
Yeah. Yes.
So we're literally
11
years of airplanes, and then within 2 years, virtually everything we associate with modern aviation modern military aviation had been developed. I don't know if do you have some images that we could share here, but you had You certainly had surveillance aircraft. You had bombers. You had air-to-ground combat. You had air-to-air combat. You had torpedo aircraft. You had reconnaissance aircraft providing protection for shipping. You had search and destroy missions for against submarines and enemy shipping. So almost everything. You had air-to-ground radio that was in development. Pretty much everything except radar that has become what we think of military aviation.
Yeah.
And so much of I know with the Commemorative Air Force, your focus is closely tied to World War II, and that's not to take anything away from it, but it is there is Americans by and large know there was a World War II, so they figure there must have been a World War I, but they're not going to be able to tell you much of anything about it. But everything that that has happened in these century plus since then can in some manner, in international relations and in military affairs, can in some manner be traced back to what took place during World War I. Right down to why the U.S. would get involved in a place like Iraq. These were lines that were drawn after the war ended. Right down to Russia as an expansive empire, which out of World War I came, the collapse of the Tsarist Empire and the rise of the Bolshevik Soviet Union, and Putin is straight out of that playbook.
Yes, it is. It is amazing. I think we think about how far we've come as a society, as humans, and yet how far we still have to go.
No, indeed.
So against the backdrop of what's happening in Europe, so we've come across this group of young men who are going to college at Yale, and life on campus at Yale University in those days is different than what I think of when I went to college and what most people do, where academics was really the key. I mean, you need to study, get good grades, and graduate with honors. It was a little different in these days, and so was the population that was going to the school. These were usually that come from very well-to-do families, and what I read in the book was that they had really thought that all they needed to know in life they had already learned in boarding school before they got to university. So they were there, and not necessarily to be socialites, but to do what they could for Yale, to be a part of something greater than just academics.
Yeah, absolutely. The balance that we think of now between the curricular and the extracurricular was highly weighted to the extracurricular. So, yes, these were there's a picture of what's known as old campus at Yale University. This is back around 1916. So, and we incidentally have to remember the U.S. was not involved in World War I until quite late. The United States, Woodrow Wilson insisted that we needed to be neutral in thought and action in times that will try men's soul. He was adamantly opposed to the U.S. getting involved. The U.S. was, by tradition, by history, since George Washington, had been a neutral nation. And he didn't want, and in 1916, he won re-election with a campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." And so America did not want to fight in this war. But America was, according to these young men that I wrote about, going to end up in this war. They were the sons of privilege. One was a Taft, one was a Rockefeller, one's father was the head of J.P. Morgan Bank, another's father was the head of the Union Pacific Railroad. You have a picture here of in the center is a guy named Frederick Truby Davison. He went by he was known as Truby, and Truby, like many of the sons of privilege, had one foot in the United States and one foot in Europe. His father was the head of the J.P. Morgan Bank. J.P. Morgan was financing the war for the Allies. J.P. Morgan floated the loans that kept the French and the British in fight, and then they used those loans to purchase U.S.-made weaponry that was being shipped over to overseas. A fellow on the right there, our right, Truby Davison's left, is Robert Lovett. Robert Lovett's dad was the head of the Union Pacific Railroad. So in the summer of 1915, like many of Sons of Privilege, Truby went to France, where he drove ambulances. He was part of the Voluntary Ambulance Corps that was made up in large measure by wealthy college students who were bringing the wounded back from the front. You know, so he knew the ravages of war. And he also knew that the trenches were a place that you ended up in the mud. And you ended up where there was a good chance of getting killed, and there was a good chance you wouldn't even see the person who killed you, or you wouldn't see the person you were trying to kill. And at that time, aviation, as it was emerging, had become sort of a seat of privilege. A lot of the pilots on all sides tended to come from the families of wealthier people. Baron von Richthofen, you know, he was a Junker. You know, these were and on the English side, the same deal. They came out of Eton and Cambridge and Oxford, and because there was this sense, oh, you needed to have some kind of education to understand airplanes, and there was also this this belief that aviation, because you were actually fighting man to man, so to speak, in the air, even though eventually it became just as brutal as anything on the ground, there was this belief that there was kind of a chivalric, you know, the last place for chivalry was in the air, and these were the knights of the air. They began to be called. And so Truby came back to the United States, and he said, you know what, I think the U.S. is going to end up in this fight. He was a smart guy. He was looking at the world situation. He said it's just not going to be possible for the United States to stay out of this. And he said, if we get in it, the place to be is in the air. And so he got together with Bob Lovett there, his buddy, who before this, the only thing he'd done was organize the junior prom at Yale. You know, these were as part of all their extracurricular activities. And then they started gathering a group of friends in the summer of 1916 from mainly fellow sons of privilege, or all of them sons of privilege, and most of them athletes at Yale. Nowadays, we think of athletics as you know, in college sports, this has become something quite universal. Back then, athletics tended to be focused more on those who could afford it. You know, sports took some money and or training, which you had to get at a place like Yale. And Yale and Harvard back then were like the Red Sox and the Yankees, they were it. And these guys, what they did, their exploits were in the newspapers, and so Truby got these guys together and sent them telegrams, cajoled them till they all came. He said, "I'm going to do a summer flying camp." He said, "And we're going to," and he said, "We're going to fly over the Long Island Sound, and if we crash, because we're going to hit water, it's not going to hurt us." So he brought in that first summer, 1916, he brought 11 of his friends to his parents' house there on the North Shore of Long Island. Like I said, Daddy was the managing partner at J.P. Morgan, and so their place on Long Island had 60 rooms on 40 waterfront acres with 45 servants at their beck and call. And these guys had a blast, but they were pretty serious about what they were doing. They would go every day to a flying boat school down in Port Washington, away about a 20-minute drive from the Davison House. And while there, they were trained by a former, actually he had flown with the Italians, and he was an experienced pilot, a guy named Dave McCullough. And McCullough was, he was sort of, he said when we were chatting before this, he was the caricature of the of a flying instructor back in the day. He was tended to drink heavily, to party a lot. He had a good time, and he loved flying. But he was serious about it with these guys, and he said, basically, you're going to learn to fly from the ground up, and he meant it literally. You're going to learn how to take these aircraft apart. I'm probably not telling you guys anything you don't know, but these airplanes were made of doped canvas, stretched over a wood frame with wires, basically piano wire tightening them, and then an underpowered pusher engine that would drive a hull, a mahogany hull across the water, like a Chris Graff runabout, and they'd say it, you'll get up on a plane when you get up to 45 miles an hour. You'll lift off at about 45 miles an hour. You'll fly at 45 miles an hour, and you'll stall at 45 miles an hour. These things were heavy, but he wanted them to know how to handle them, how to put them together, and they got their elbows up, their arms up to their elbow in grease, but they did it wearing white bucks and gabardine slacks and rep ties and bow ties, and looking slick. And and they got it together, and actually the world started taking notice. They got a lot of coverage in various newspapers because you had these sons of privilege out there who were learning to fly. And flight was still very uncommon in the United States. So but Truby wanted this group to become in some way in the service of the U.S. government. And so he said, let's create a, he worked together with some people in the Navy. He said, let's create an aerial defense force, that will keep the war away from our shores. And this would be a coast patrol with the idea that we would set up air stations all along the coast and fly out. And if we saw enemy ships approaching shore, we could then come back or radio to the Navy. The Navy could send out ships to repulse any potential invaders. Now, he also wanted this to become a Navy aviation reserve squadron, and that the families would support. And he went to see the Secretary of the Navy then, Josephus Daniels, and Daniels was he wasn't a Navy man. He certainly wasn't an aviator at that time. In 1916, the Navy had a rule that officers weren't allowed to fly because it was too dangerous, and the budget for the Navy aviation was enough to buy an airplane, but not enough to fly it. So the Navy had basically by 1917 had a total of about 70, a little less than 70 qualified naval aviators who'd gotten their wings. And so Truby, being the son of the head of J.P. Morgan, went down to see the Secretary of the Navy in what's now called the Eisenhower Office Building, and waltzed into his office and said, "We'd like to become part of the Navy as a aviation reserve squadron." And Daniel said, "Well, you boys are great, and I love your patriotism and your idealism, but we don't need you." He had no idea what purpose an air arm for the Navy could serve. But there was a young Assistant Secretary of the Navy down the hall who offered to do what he could to support the group, and that was a fellow named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he, when they returned to Yale in the fall of 1916, he did what he could to connect them with the New London submarine base in Connecticut, and they began to work together with the Navy and to see if they could track submarines and to see if the submarines could be aware of airplanes tracking them. And they enlarged the group during that year at Yale, and then in the Kaiser's Admiral told them, "Yeah, this is the original group of from that first summer." Excuse me. You can see Bob Lovett in the back, and Truby's right in front of Bob, maybe we'll talk about some of the others in this photo as we go along. But they enlarged the group, and then the Kaiser's Admiral said, if you give me the opportunity to start attacking all shipping going into England, into Great Britain, I can promise you that we will force England to its knees, and not a single American troop will ever reach Europe, will ever get to the front. And boy, was he wrong. So he started sinking shipping, and there were a series of other events that took place. Yeah, here you see the guys in front of one of their aircraft looking dapper. They got called up in late March. First college boys in the land who were called up. The entire U.S. Navy Air Reserve was put on including their airplanes, were put on a 3-car private train that ran down to Palm Beach, where they bunked at the Breakers, that very high-end hotel down there, and then eventually they took a hotel of their own, and they began to train. And The Navy provided officers for them. That, by the way, is Dave McCullough on the left there in this photograph. And the Navy provided trainers. This was being the Gold Spoon Brigade. Their families paid for the whole shebang, and they returned north in the summer, having all but one having soloed. They in early August 1917, they flew for their wings of gold. Of course, in their case, purchased at Tiffany's, and then all but one got his wings. And that one was Truby Davison. And when folks read the book, they'll see what happened. Yeah, there's Truby, the leader of the group, who never didn't manage to get his wings for 50 years.
Well, as they almost all have earned their wings, what was their next step to actually be deployed overseas?
Yeah. So when the U.S. went to war, it had an air force in total smaller than Bulgaria's. These guys were all among the first 100 Navy aviators to win their wings. And so they basically did everything for a nation that didn't have an air force. They built bases literally from scratch here and overseas. They tested weaponry. They helped to develop engines, aircraft engines in the U.S., the Liberty engine. And then many of them began to ship out and to go over there. And they were those from this group were among the very first Americans to get over there. And the first group flew with the Royal Flying Corps on what was known as the Spiderweb Patrol, going out over the English Channel and the North Sea, searching in a spiderweb pattern for the German U-boats to try and stop them from attacking the Allied shipping going back and forth to France or down to around to Italy and into the Mediterranean. And in fact, one member of the group, Al Sturtevant, was the first uniform American killed in aviation combat, which really sent a shockwave through all these guys. They were in constant touch. These guys were educated, so they wrote beautiful letters back and forth, describing what they were doing, explaining what was going on, and then lamenting the loss of their comrade. Eventually, 2 others were killed from the group. It was, it brought home the fact that this was war, and now it was real. And but the Kaiser's Admiral said not a single American will ever get over there. By the summer of 1918, there were more than a million Americans who were flooding into the trenches and beginning to shift the weight of the war. But really, the thing that all these guys wanted to do was to fly combat aircraft, the fighter airplanes, and nothing more so than that most famous airplane of the First World War, the Sopwith Camel. And one member of the group, David Swinton Ingalls, became Sinton Ingalls. Let's see, he was the great nephew of William Howard Taft, President William Howard Taft, and he became the Navy's first air ace. during the war. Shot down, was credited with shooting down 6 enemy aircraft. He was involved in all kinds of raids. He was kind of a hard charging. He had been a hockey player in college and was hard charging and really not afraid of much of anything. And he would go out on hunts as a lone wolf. In later years, he managed to survive by, just by, in some ways, by sheer luck. In later years, he was famous for buzzing the Cleveland Browns stadium upside down in his airplane. But he was a great pilot. Yeah.
So now they're all in the Navy, but yet this was not where they were flying was not. There were no aircraft carriers at the time, so they became land-based pilots quite quickly, so they could enter the war. And another thing that I don't think we take into consideration these days either is that the airplanes, I mean, aviation was in its infancy. They were very difficult to fly. They were not very forgiving at all, and the life expectancy of fighter pilots was nearly as bad as those who were in the trenches.
Yeah, well, in many ways worse. The average lifespan for a pilot at the front was about 3 weeks. If you managed to live long enough, you began to understand some of the ways of survival. Some of it was, of course, just good fortune or bad fortune, but you also learned to have spatial awareness and to understand where threats could come from and how to be aware of your surroundings, your total spatial surroundings. But they were flying at 20,000 feet in these airplanes made out of wire wooden canvas. They could dive at 200 miles an hour by 1918. They were under regular attack. These pilots became hypoxic, didn't get enough oxygen at those levels. In addition, when you're up at 20,000 feet, the temperature would drop to way below zero. And when you're flying at cruising at 120 miles an hour, frostbite was common. And if you look at pictures of pilots, if you take a look at photographs when they started out back then, and they look like young men, and by the end, within a matter of months, they aged massively, just tremendously older. The force of the elements, plus seeing the horrors of seeing your comrades shot down, and it was a bad death. It was a bad death. Airplanes would catch on fire. They were known as flaming coffins. A bullet that hit you in the wrong spot could cause your airplane just to collapse around itself. Here you see a bomber from a 4-engine bomber from the period. I was talking to Igor Sikorsky Jr., the son of the great helicopter pilot inventor, and his Junior said to me, my father used to say that back then, the way you knew that somebody was a good aircraft designer, because his father had been in the designing aircraft for the Russian Air Force. He said the way you knew somebody was a good aircraft designer was he was still alive.
So very true.
Yeah. Everything was experimental, and
right.
that was why you see when you look at the early airplanes, some of them look like steampunk contraptions here. These they had pusher engines. They would combine pusher and puller engines. Yeah, here you see the flying boat from submarine patrols, and they came in all sizes and shapes, massive wingspans because they were the engines were underpowered, and so they needed as much lift as they could possibly get.
It was an amazing time. And as we talk about the technology, there was no such thing as self-sealing fuel tanks. So you're right. A one bullet in the wrong spot, and the airplane could ignite. Just things like that we see in World War II, where you're armoring either the gunners or the cockpits to try to protect the occupants. That was not even thought of in World War I, because, as you mentioned, the technology of aviation, of lift, it was kind of outstripping the ability of the engines to actually get the airplanes in the air. So that was a limitation that that really held back a lot of design during World War I.
Yeah, yeah. And in addition, at least on the Allied side, they didn't allow flyers to have parachutes.
Right.
They said, take up too much space, and then they worried that in the midst of combat, that they might decide, this is not looking good. I'm just going to abandon it and jump out of the airplane.
Yeah, definitely different times.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
when the club members are over in Europe, when you read the book, because you need to read this book, you'll discover some of the different storylines from each of the young men who were there. Not all of them, but the key elements in the club. But just kind of give us a sense of maybe what they were going through when they were assigned to combat.
Yeah, yeah. So what I tried to do in the book was to get the sense of, so when they went overseas, they were by and large dispersed to various bases. Either they were sent to work with the British on the submarine patrols. They were sent to train with the French, and then some of them were sent to train with the English Air Force, Royal Flying Corps, and learned how to fly the fighters. This was the thing they all really wanted to do. One member of the group was sent to be the executive officer at the Dunkirk U.S. Naval Air Station. The U.S. took that over. It was so close to the lines that it was under artillery fire. There was a guy named Artemus Gates, and he was the executive officer there. One of his pilots was downed at sea. He got word about that. He personally flew out under fire and rescued that pilot. He became one of just 3 Navy officers or Navy servicemen who was nominated for the Medal of Honor. And then he got into, as the weight of the U.S. forces came in, it was an all-in fight to the Central Power forces tried to, before the U.S. could get fully engaged, tried to break the Allied lines, because they knew this was, once the Americans arrived, it was going to be a big problem for them. And Gates ended up fighting with a French squadron, French fighter. He was a big guy. He was a football player, football star, the captain of the Yale football team, well known, kind of like Pat Tillman from the NFL going when he went to Afghanistan. And he got shot down and was presumed lost. And this was national news in the United States because of losing this football star. And when you read the book, you'll find out about his dramatic escape and what else took place with him. But that was one example. The David Ingalls and Kenny Mcleish, the one I mentioned at the beginning, they ended up learning to fly the Sopwith Camel, and they went to the front where they fought again with joined British squadrons, because U.S. didn't have any of its aircraft of its own. It was not until the very end of the war, the armistice that took place on November 11th, 1918, at the very end of the war, that the U.S. began for the first time shipping aircraft over. So we had to get our aircraft from our allies, and we were flying their airplanes. But these guys, Ingalls and Mcleish in particular, were fantastic pilots, just fantastic pilots, and they got the best training. They got the best training from the English, and then they went to the front. And as I mentioned, Ingalls ended up being the Navy's first air ace, and Mcleish had his own kill, but his end was tragic. Trying to think of the other. Robert Lovett. So Robert Lovett, whose most significant activity before the war had been organizing the junior prom. Well, it turns out the guy's a genius. He's got a photographic memory, and he also knows logistics, because he used to go out with his father on the Union Pacific Railroad, and they would make annual inspection tours. And he knew that locomotives required repair, and they would be sitting in the shops while they were being readied to go back out on the lines. And so he said, what are we doing chasing a needle in a haystack around the North Sea looking for these submarines that, can dive underwater and, if we find them. And he said, what we need to do is carry out a bombing campaign on the submarine pens that were primarily in Belgium. And so he went out on bombing campaigns with English pilots, with English Air Forces. He was the first uniformed American to fly in bombers, and he witnessed for himself the weight of a bombing campaign. And then he went back. This is a 23-year-old. He went back to headquarters. They knew what they had in him. He was extraordinary. And he went back to headquarters, and he started organizing the first American strategic bombing campaign. And he eventually was, at the ripe age of 23, was the chief of the first American night bomber wing with 1,200 men under him. And he would come back in World War II as the head of the Army's Undersecretary or Assistant Secretary of War for Air, man responsible for building up that extraordinary bomber force that had such an impact in Europe in particular, and eventually threw its weight into the Pacific. And then his counterpart during World War II, the Navy's Undersecretary of War of the Navy for Air, was Artemus Gates, the fellow I talked about who got shot down during World War I. So out of this small group came the two civilian heads of our air forces during World War II. Lovett continued on and played major roles in government.
And Lovett actually recognized what was going on post World War I. He recognized what was going on in Germany before the start of World War II, that the Germans were building up their air force, and that in this country we were blind to it or didn't want to see it, whichever theory you subscribe to. And he actually advocated for increasing aircraft production, and knowing through those inspection tours that the United States was not ready to ramp up production, and it was actually his thought to get the automobile companies involved when the time was right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
as you said, a genius. And I just want to point out the book that's behind me, one of your other books, 1941, the Shadow War, focuses in very specifically on 1941 before Pearl Harbor. It is also a great read, and I recommend
Oh,
both of those books. So,
thanks,
uh,
Steve.
but but it is amazing how this small group really did have an influence not only in World War One, World War Two, Korea, and beyond, up into the '60s, the very early '60s.
Yeah. 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 No, their impact. Um, any number of them were of the survivors were called back into service. Uh, Ingalls ended up being the an admiral in charge of the Pearl Harbor Naval Air Station. Um, Others were called back into service, and here's Lovett being sworn in as he followed George Marshall as the I forget whether this is when he was becoming Assistant Secretary of State or whether he when he succeeded George Marshall as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely amazing group.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Well, we are just running a little short on time here, but I wanted to also mention, along with the book, you were involved in a documentary that kind of tells the same story with some absolutely stunning photography. How did that documentary come to be?
okay, yeah, it's a great story, and I'll try to keep it short. Um, the one of my books was on or the book, the Millionaires Unit was sitting on a stack at a bookstore in, I think, Manhattan Beach, California. And the grandson of one of the members of what was called Millionaires Unit by the press, saw his grandfather here at age 19 or 20 sitting in on the photograph. And he said, "My God, I know a little bit about that my grandfather was in world pilot in World War One. His grandfather was John Voorhees, who was later a 10-term congressman and became, I think, during World War II, the only sitting congressman to be activated as for civilian air patrol duty. And so uh, he was a filmmaker out in LA, and he got in touch with me and said, "Hey, is anybody making a documentary about this?" And I said, no. And so he got together with another filmmaker, Derek Greer, both of them very talented guys, and they bootstrapped a documentary. My role in this was just to say, go, go, go. I'd love to see it. And so they used with my book as the inspiration. They and actually what you see here is still from the documentary. They went down to New Zealand to shoot with Peter Jackson Air Force down there. Peter Jackson has put together a 50 plane, Air Force of World War One aircraft, reproduction aircraft, from his company called Vintage Aviator, the Vintage Aviator. And he puts on air shows, and he gave them permission to basically use those airplanes to film a number of flying scenes, which are really powerful in the documentary.
Yes.
And I've actually been working with Ron King, the son of John Voorhees, and we've been working on a sort of planning out a what we hope will eventually become a limited series, a fictional limited series based on this group, sort of Downton Abbey, an American Downton Abbey meets Top Gun. And so certainly if any of your listeners know, I know there are people like Harrison Ford and John Travolta who are just, and David Ellison, people who are, true aviation fanatics. If any of them know them, knock on their door and tell them what we're up to. We'd love to talk to them.
I love it. Downton Abbey meets Top Gun. That would be a wonderful series. I would look for that.
Okay, good.
The by the way, the documentary is available on Amazon Prime. I know it's there. Is it available anywhere else?
I believe it's on Apple Plus.
Okay.
Um, I don't have I didn't have a formal relationship. I'm just a talking head in the
Yeah.
documentary, but I believe it is widely available. And then Derek Greer, with the same film production company, then did another documentary about the Lafayette Escadrille,
Oh,
which
okay.
is a predecessor group to the Millionaires Unit.
Well, good. Well, Mark, if someone's interested in getting a copy of your book, we've got the web address that takes them to your website. And also mentioned 1941, The Shadow War. You've written a couple of other books as well. Why don't you tell us a
Oh,
little bit about those?
okay, well, thank you. Yeah, so as an author, I'm somebody who's always been drawn to story and character, and as I said, I'm not a particular specialist in period um, field. So the Millionaires Unit was the first book. My next book after that is called The Bonfire, The Siege and Burning of Atlanta. It's sort of a true story of Gone with the Wind, the rise and fall of Atlanta in the Civil War, which is an extraordinary city filled with rich tales of everybody from the richest man in town who was a slave to, of course, William Tecumseh Sherman and his attack on the city, and the mayor of Atlanta who was opposed to secession. Then I did, as you mentioned, 1941, Fighting the Shadow War, about the period before U.S. entry into World War II, which is focused on how the U.S. was simultaneously going to war while debating whether it should go to war. And so fighting in the shadows, both at sea and at home. And then most recently, in just this past February, I published a book about Admiral Hyman Rickover, a short biography called Admiral Hyman Rickover, Engineer of Power, about his role in creating the nuclear navy and his extraordinary character, a man who rose from poverty in Russia, Tsarist Russia, Tsarist Russian-controlled Poland, to become the longest-serving officer in American history, despite the fact that he despised the Navy and the Navy despised him. A real fighter, an extraordinary character, brilliant, difficult, a wonderful character. So those are the books I've published. I'm working on a new biography of Thomas Watson Jr., the man who basically created the computer industry in America.
Awesome.
And
Well, we wish you luck with the new book, and I look forward to reading some of your others as well. I have to catch up on my reading, my Marc Wortman reading. I'll put that on my reading list.
okay, well, wonderful, Steve. I've
Mark,
really enjoyed this, and I
yes,
hope the listeners have too.
I hope so. I hope folks enjoyed it. I certainly did. And again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Don't forget to click the like or subscribe or follow us buttons so you know about future shows. And if you have any ideas for any future topics, we'd love to hear from you. Send Leah Block an email at media@cafhq.org. Thanks again, Mark, for being here tonight and sharing your insights and the book, The Millionaires Unit. Until next time, from the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Buss. Have a good night.
Good night. Okay.